So what will we do today in the morning of the Southern Hemisphere and in the afternoon of the Northern Hemisphere is this online seminar during half a day. It's an initiative of the Global Humanities Network, and in this case is a joint venture between the Universidad Diego Portales, the Centro para las Humanidades, and Cambridge University. Here in Chile, we will be hosting the seminar. It's a seminar on racial capitalism. That is the title of the seminar. Histories of Racial Capitalism in the Global South. And it aims at showing the deep connection between traditional subfields of social history and the new histories of racial capitalism that have emerged in the last decade. And building on the development of this rapidly growing field, we gathered 4 papers here and 4 presentations now that continue to illustrate the diversity of the histories of racial capitalism through a variety of geo-historical perspectives. From South Africa's gold diamonds in the late 19th century and the construction of Black consciousness in the 20th century to the colonial violence of forced displacements and dispositions that triggered current and anti-capitalist decolonizing politics in the Americas, from the problematic racialized origins and genealogy of the modern democracy to the colonial roots of Brazil racial capitalism that continues to inform the current political agenda. These papers and these presentations present a common understanding of the racialized nature of capitalism, following Destin, Jenkins, and Leroy's definition of racial capitalism. These papers don't use the term racial capitalism as a variety of capitalism, rather understand that from the beginning, I'm quoting, from the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade and the colonization of the Americas onward, all capitalism in material profitability and ideological coherence is constitutive of racial capitalism as a whole. This panel now here seeks to promote a broader understanding of the colonial origins and the dynamics of systems of racial subordination that continue operating in the capitalist social order of the global South. So we have 4 presentations, and what will we do as a dynamic for this seminar is that we will do one presentation, then we have questions and comments, and then the other presentation until we complete the 4 presentations. So I will be presenting respectively also the professors who will be doing these presentations. In the first place, we have Professor Saul Dubow. He's South African born and educated. Saul Dubow is the Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at Cambridge University. He is the author of several books and articles on South Africa, including Racial Segregation and the Origin of Apartheid, the African National Congress, and Apartheid 1948-1994. His presentation will be on a century of debates about racial capitalism in South Africa. Please, Professor Dubow, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being invited to give this presentation, and also want to thank the organizers of the Global Humanities Initiative, of which I'm part, for this opportunity. So it's what is it, 1 o'clock on the south coast of England. We're in the middle of a heat wave. and it's very pleasant to meet you, to be in Santiago this afternoon for cooler weather. So I'm going to begin by acknowledging the work of Jenkins and Leroy. It happens that, of course, they do make brief mention in the introduction of the South African case, but they don't explore it in any detail. And it's my contention, and part of a book that I'm writing at the moment about South Africa's place in the global world as a global problem, that actually quite a lot of 19th and 20th century theories about capitalism, but not just about capitalism, also about race, were developed in relation to South Africa in this period. Now, I know there are always risks of exaggerating the importance of, as a historian of the particular time that you deal with, and also the country or the area that one's looking at. So I'm mindful of that, and also mindful, of course, of the history as someone who teaches world history, of the fact that Latin America, not least because of its long and deep history of slavery, is equally or more important. But I hope to be able to persuade you that there is an important comparative angle, and that South Africa can help to clarify some of the issues that are raised by the contributors in that volume by Jenkins and Leroy. So where to start? Well, the history of South Africa actually is also a history of slavery and goes back to the first colonial encounter, which goes back to the 17th century, actually. But the real point at which capitalism emerges in regard to race must be the period of the 1860s and 1870s. It's in the 1860s that diamonds are discovered in South Africa, and about a decade later, gold is found. They're both found in regions that are in the interior of the country, far away from the existing merchant base, agricultural base. And this really transforms a country, which of course is not a country. There is no place called South Africa. It's a region. And there's enormous centrifugal forces as capital and investors from all around the world flock to Kimberley, into what we now know as Johannesburg, in order to exploit the deep level mining processes involved in gold and diamonds. Now, of course, there are many things that the mining magnates don't have. There's a shortage of basic materials, wood, water, but the greatest problem is how to attract labor. And the mechanism that was developed from the 1860s and 70s by a number of magnates, and probably if there's one who you will be familiar with, is the name Cecil John Rhodes. If anybody has followed the Rhodes Must Fall campaigns in South Africa and in Britain and elsewhere. And Cecil John Rhodes was one of the great magnates involved initially in diamonds and then in gold. And he was also the Prime Minister of the Cape. And he was not alone, of course, but he was one of the innovators in what was known as the compound system. And the compound system was a system initially developed, partly the rationale was to stop diamonds being stolen by workers, but it was a highly surveyed incarcereal system, really, to make sure that Africans who were involved in the mining of diamonds were kept under very strict conditions on compounds. Now, partly it was about the rationale was to stop stealing, but there was a deeper reason, and Rhodes understood this very well. He was responsible for passing a law called the Glengarry Act in 1893. And this was that the only way that you could really persuade large numbers of African peasants to come to the mines was to compel them. And how to compel them? Well, you compel them initially through the market by imposing taxes. But one of the ways in which this was done was through the evolving system of what is known as the migrant labor system. The migrant labor system effectively meant that men would come often from hundreds or thousands of miles to the gold and diamond mines They'd be paid salaries, but salaries were often only paid at the end of their year-long or 18-month-long contracts, which meant that you had to use the peasant or tribal system in the rural reserves, the chiefs, to enable this. They would be responsible for, in a sense, taking care of women and children in loco parentis, as it were. And there is a lot of debate as to whether this was deliberately designed by the mining magnates as the cheapest form of labor, sort of slavery, as some people have called it, or whether it was really the only way that they could persuade Africans to come to the mines. Now, I could go on for a long period discussing the system of migrant labor, but the basic structure has been analyzed in terms of a subsidy from the rural areas to the urban areas. That is to say, that the argument went that if women and children were left in the rural areas taking care of subsistence production, then the men who come to Johannesburg and Kimberley did not really have to be paid the full wages of a proletariat which needs to reproduce itself. They would only need to be paid sufficient to be able to buy things like blankets or cooking pots or hose, that they could, or guns actually very often, that they could take back at the end of their contract. So this is a super exploitative system that develops over the best part of 50 years, recruitment and so forth. Now, at the time, in the late 19th century, there were very few people, if anyone at all, who really saw this as a system of racial capitalism. But and for reasons that are actually perhaps a little bit less obvious than one imagines. But what really begins to shift in the late 19th century is the way aggressive British imperialism, and particularly the conquest of African peoples, the Zulu War of 1879, which is one of the great imperial wars of conquest. It's often been argued that the destruction of the Zulu by the British was really led by a need or a desire or a perceived right to break the power of the power of this dominant African chiefdom in order to ensure that Zulu-speaking workers could be released from the land and be able to work on white agriculture and in the mines. And, you know, there's a lot to be said about this argument, not least because if one looks at the history of Indians in South Africa, they were brought out to Natal, where of course, Natal, KwaZulu, this is exactly the area, in the 1860s. And they were brought out from India to work the sugarcane plantations because it was impossible until that point, in order to persuade blacks to engage in plantation agriculture. So, you know, that would certainly suggest that one of the main motives in breaking the Zulu kingdom was to release large floods of African labor for the mines and for agriculture. The second big imperial event was the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. And this was the culmination of high imperialism in the British Empire, I would argue. It was a huge war. It was a war not fought against blacks. It was a war fought by the British Empire against the Boer, that's to say, Afrikaner republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And it was the case that where the Transvaal was the center of the gold mining industry, and it was ruled by a Dutch potentate, I suppose you could call him, called Kruger. And Milner, the great arch-imperialist and modernizer, argued that really in order to fully liberate the productive forces of the mines, he didn't necessarily argue this, but the point was made to him, you needed to smash the power of this medieval theocratic Boer state in order to really allow the gold mining industry, which by now is the largest in the world, to flourish. So the point that one needs to note here is that, of course, the Anglo-Zulu War is fought against Africans. The British war against the Boers is fought against Dutch. It's white people fighting against white people. Of course, that's not entirely true, as we know. There were, in fact, many Africans fighting on both sides, but there was a tacit agreement in this gentleman's war, and a gentleman's war it was not, that you should not include Africans in these hostilities. To include Africans in the hostilities is effectively to make Africans citizens of a sort, or to expand their political rights or claims. So this is an important point, because by the time that the Anglo-Boer War was happening in 1899 to 1902, and particularly after the conclusion of the war in 1902, the mines are no longer operating, the country is in a very bad state. You have this process of what is known as reconciliation, a restoration, which leads to, in 1910, to the creation of the modern South African state. And the modern South African state is created as a result of this reconciliation between Boers or Afrikaans speakers and English speakers, who say that let bygones be bygones. But of course, what they're also saying is recognizing that the real underlying problem of South Africa, and it may seem obvious to us now, but it was not obvious at the time, was that the real underlying problem was between whites and blacks. Now, why was it not obvious at the time? It was not obvious at the time because although you have visitors like Anthony Trollope, the 19th century novelist, saying, oh, he comes out and he says, well, of course, the problem of South Africa is the problem of blacks. It's a black country. It always was, and it always will be. That epigrammatic recognition was by no means shared, and nor was it thought through. And indeed, through the Boer War and the period that follows, the real active social forces are at continuing competition on the gold mines, and also and elsewhere, the diamond mines as well, between a white working class and a capitalist class. And this is the point at which people like J.A. Hobson, the British journalist who writes about capitalism in South Africa, who inspires Rosa Luxemburg, and but in turn, Lenin is following the history of the South African War quite closely. And it is very formative in the history of imperial capitalism. And it is, of course, deeply racialized. But this is where things get quite interesting. When we say it's racialized, the period at the time, the Boer War was always represented as a racial problem. But when they meant race, they did not mean blacks and whites. They meant the difference between Boers and British. The color problem was what we now know as the racial problem. And this misuse or deliberate use of race and color is something that only becomes clarified in around the 1920s, when people recognize, or when it's widely recognized, that the problems of race is really the problems between whites and blacks. Now, I'm going to just backtrack a bit, because straight after 1902, the end of the war, part of that process of reconciliation is an understanding, as I've already suggested, that the real problem in the future is to resolve the problem between, or the historical conflict between whites and blacks. And the word racial segregation is first coined around 1902, and it is developed as a systematic theory with a lot of concentration on the American South as a means to develop a systematic political structure in the new South Africa of the exclusion of blacks from political rights, of the division of land between whites and blacks, of controls over movement of blacks, and in particular, securing the rights of white workers to what is known as the rights of civilized labor. Now, what is the rights of civilized labor? Effectively, it means recognizing that whites workers have to be paid full wages, whereas black workers can be only paid these kind of semi-wages, the wages that assume that because they're migrant laborers, they don't need full wages. So many Marxists went on to argue that this was the epitome of a super exploitative system, which of course it was. But the problem is that you now have a double division between white workers wanting to defend their rights and their privileges as white workers, as supervisors, stopping blacks from doing skilled work, for example, which happens. But that, of course, is structurally unbalanced. And there are a series of major white working strikes, 1907, 1914, and 1922, when white workers, English and Afrikaans, rise up against the new South African state and try and overthrow the state. And effectively what they are interested in is preserving their privileged position and ensuring that blacks cannot compete with them as laborers. And they prepare to overthrow the state. And this is the moment where the South African state, Jan Smuts, actually bombs the white workers by using aircraft. So it's a very serious moment in this new fragile South African state. So racial segregation is pretty much, it's not complete, but we have a whole range of legislation that comes through in the 1920s. And therefore it's in the 1920s, when racial segregation is now really being implemented, that there is the shift between understanding the problems of race and the problems of color, and this recognition that actually blacks are the working class, the proletariat. Now, this recognition is not easy to achieve. In the first place, South African white workers, they're influenced by syndicalists, they're influenced by by the Wobbly movement, they're influenced by British socialists, and the Communist Party, which is formed around 1919, at first takes for granted that the proletariat is white. And it's only in 1928, at a meeting of the Comintern in Moscow, that the Comintern instructs the South African Communist Party to develop a new idea called the Native Republic. And the Native Republic really argues that the proletariat is black and white, in fact, largely black, and therefore the first step in supporting a revolution is to support African nationalism. Now, at the time, as well in the 1920s, there was the rise of black trades unionism. There's a union called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, led by Clemens Kadali, which takes a lot of inspiration from America, from Marcus Garvey. And so there's a lot of black trade unionism, which is beginning to develop alongside white trade unions. And the Communist Party goes through a very awkward place, including expulsions and so forth, as it has to rethink who the proletariat of South Africa is. And this goes on to be developed by the Communist Party by about the 1950s, where they come through a new phrase, which really takes us almost to the present, of colonialism of a special type. South Africa is colonialism of a special type. It's not classic colonialism because there is an indigenous white community, but it is colonialism of a special type. And we could talk about this for a very long time. But I think the 1920s then is a big shift in understanding what racial capitalism, the combination of the 1928 Native Republic, colonialism of special type, is a full theoretical recognition of the fact that when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about racial capitalism. We're not talking about conflicts fundamentally between white workers and white management. We're talking about an African working class, which is seen now as the vector of revolution and change and liberation. So moving ahead a little bit, we move into the period of apartheid. I'm skipping over quite a bit. 1948, the Afrikaner nationalists regroup, and they are successful in the elections of 1948, and they come to power under this term apartheid. Nobody really knows what apartheid actually means. They don't even necessarily know what it means themselves. It's a slogan, but it is quite clear that apartheid is going to, one thing that is clear is that apartheid is going to double down on segregation. Apartheid is going to further extend the racial state at every level, from people's individual relationships, who you can see, who you can sleep with, who you can marry, to the conditions of industrial labor, the conditions of agricultural labor. And by 1948, we're now into the period of decolonization, of course. We're in the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights, the decolonial moment. What is really distinctive about apartheid is not just that it becomes the most racialized, in legal terms, society after the end of Nazi Germany, but also that it is moving in a completely different direction to the rest of the world. That's the way it is seen. Now, by the 1970s, well, through this period, the 1950s and 60s, the Communist Party after 1960, after Sharpeville, the African National Congress, they are all banned and suppressed in the crackdown that happens after 1960, when South Africa for the first time comes to international attention as a global problem. And in exile and underground, the ANC Communist Alliance begins to theorize once again this idea of colonialism of a special type. And one of the conditions of this alliance between the Communist Party, between the ANC, between the Colored People's Organization, and between white Marxist group in the Congress of Democrats is a form of multiracialism, which adopts nationalism, but in which nationalism, African nationalism, has to exist quite uneasily with a Marxist interpretation of capitalism, and also with an insistence that, as we have in the Freedom Charter of 1955, which is South Africa's kind of manifesto of liberation, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And it's at this period that the ideas of non-racism develop, and the Communist Party, of course, exemplifies this non-racism. So does the Liberal Party, but that's a different question. But the essence of this idea is that apartheid is not really a racial problem. Yes, there is a problem of race. It's a major problem, but the underlying problem, the argument goes, is capitalism. If you can solve the problem of capitalism and imperialism, racism, it is hoped, will somehow wither away. Race is seen as epiphenomenal. It's seen as superstructural. Now, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but unfortunately, I'm not oversimplifying all that much. In the 1970s, there's a group of intellectuals, new left theorists who emerge. Some of them are from the Communist Party, many are not. They're often called the revisionists. And they begin to rethink this process. This is a period, of course, where the South African state is at its most powerful. There's no overt black resistance within the country, so it's a good time for thinking. And the revisionists really begin to look at the history of South Africa, and they say, look, this is not really a story of race. It's a story of the history of South Africa, actually, in some ways, as a history of racial cooperation on the frontier, etc. It is capitalism is the key. This is when everyone is studying, again, the gold and diamond mines, theories of exploitation, the triple patriarchy, and so forth. And part of their antagonists, or the people that they're wanting to argue against, are liberals, economic liberals. Economic liberals who, from the 1920s, have argued that the problems of segregation and apartheid is a problem which is, in a sense, artificial, because the free market wants to employ people, as many people who are skilled, to expand demand, and really the capitalists have no interest in color. That left alone, if it wasn't for the Afrikaner nationalist state, capitalists would embrace a free market in labor. And actually, the villains of the piece now become the white workers. They say it's the white workers who now are more Afrikaans than English, although earlier in the century it was the other way around. They say the white workers are using their political position to protect their interests. And if the free market could reign, South Africa could develop as a liberal capitalist society. And there are many contributors to this debate. And Milton Friedman comes to South Africa. I think you in Chile know the name pretty well. Some of the same discussions, I think, that is happening in Chile at this time is happening in South Africa in the 1970s. Now, Then there is a further twist. So this idea, I think we can gloss as racial capitalism, as rather of capitalist racism. But in this interlude, from the late 1960s, there is another moment, as it were, which perhaps derives also from the 1968 moment. The ANC is not very active at all, it's illegal. And we now get the emergence of the Black consciousness movement led by Steve Biko in the late 1960s. And the Black consciousness movement, intellectually, Biko has a most interesting set of debates with a philosopher called Rick Turner, who studies in Paris. He's an existentialist, he's a Marxist. And Biko, in these discussions, makes clear the idea that liberals, again, are the problem, as it were, because even liberal students who oppose the apartheid regime do not recognize that they themselves are the direct or indirect beneficiaries of a racialized capitalist system, which means that they have the freedom as the middle classes to be Marxists or liberals or whatever, but actually they are the beneficiaries. And it is Biko who says race is at the heart of the South African problem, and he does so using a whole range, Black Power theorists. He's also interested in Fanon, in existentialism, and so forth. So this begins to coalesce a different theory in which race and identity is brought back right to the center of the analysis of the South African divide. But Biko too is influenced by the debates that he has with Marxists. Biko is killed by the South African state in 1977, very young, a hugely important and charismatic man. And there remains, after this debate, as it were, that runs right through the liberation history of South Africa. You've got Nelson Mandela and his compatriots from the ANC on Robben Island. You get the Black consciousness students arriving on Robben Island. The Black consciousness and the ANC are, certainly not in agreement. And there is a long discussion that goes on about what would have happened if Biko hadn't been killed. Would Biko have formed common cause with the left in terms of understanding a notion of racial capitalism that could also allow for a future non-racial state? How long have I got? I'm feeling I'm taking a little too long. Can't hear you. Just indicate 5, 10. I can't hear you, Martin. You're muted.
Yes, you can continue between 5 and 10 more minutes. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So this really is the moment. We're now in the 1970s and 1980s. The 1980s is the period of late apartheid. From 1973, it's probably important to say that around these debates about racial capitalism and capitalist racism is the recognition by revisionists from the early 1970s that the South African economy has boomed under apartheid, which rather suggests that there's structural reasons for this to happen, that South African whites are now amongst the most prosperous whites in the world, ranking along with California. And that is presumptive evidence that this is a capitalist racial system or a racial capitalist system. But from after the oil crisis of 1973, South Africa begins to experience a secular process of economic decline. It's not straight, but it goes up and down. But the point is that this is also the moment where the Black working class, led often by Black consciousness, which was not a natural connection, begins to assert itself. It's a point at which the South African state and indeed South African capitalists realize that South African, as the liberals argue, that this system of racial capitalism is inefficient, that the market is constrained. And this is the moment in the 1970s where the government begins to entertain the notion of fundamental reforms. And for the first time, the Afrikaner nationalist government is actually beginning to consult with capitalists themselves. So there's no doubt that capitalists are mounting very serious critiques of this white exclusivist regime. And by the 1980s, in this period of late apartheid, as even the government says we don't believe in apartheid anymore, and they shift to other justifications, Cold War, defense of order, anti-communism, and so forth, we now have this increasing competition, as it were, and this is referred to by Jenkins and Leroy through the intellectual Neville Alexander, about who was also on the island but opposed to Mandela, about whether you need to privilege, whether you begin, your analysis begins with an idea of capitalist exploitation or racial exploitation. And there is a clear political division between the Black consciousness trade unions, the ANC aligned or Communist Party aligned trade unions. So this is a very live debate which goes all the way through to the end of apartheid and to the beginnings of the rethinking of the new South Africa under Nelson Mandela. So I'm going to begin to draw to a close. And I want to just come back to the one or two points. First of all, I am interested in what you have to say from your Chilean experience. As I've suggested, I think the neoliberalism was tested in Chile to destruction, but neoliberalism was also quite important in the discourse about apartheid and anti-apartheid in South Africa at this time. And I think some of the same people who become expert in Chile are also thinking about South Africa. So that's something I'd like to talk a little bit more about. The second is this underlying question of settler colonialism, which has become so much part of the discourse, certainly of the ex-British imperial states of Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Settler colonialism has not really been to the fore in South Africa, but it is increasingly the case, of course, also in Israel, Palestine. And one of the things I would like to ask you is not just a Chilean story, but also a story about Argentina and Ecuador, about the salience of settler colonialism and its relationship to racial capitalism. And I ask this because it's almost conventional to argue the comparison between South Africa and Brazil. But there have been very, very few comparisons, to my knowledge, that go beyond the Brazilian comparison, which is also about the question of race and its relationship to capitalism. And finally, just to go back to Jenkins and Leroy, their argument, as Martin has pointed out, is very much premised on the idea that there is that race and capitalism, at some level, are inseparable. Racial capitalism is not the exception to capitalism; it's the norm, as I understand it. And actually, an adjacent argument is being made about liberalism. That is to say, that racism is not something that liberalism eschews necessarily, or has very little to do with liberalism, but actually that the story of liberalism is also, going back to the 18th century, also a story of race. So there are a lot of things to discuss. I would argue that South Africa in various ways exemplifies many of these questions, and I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dubow. I think you've provided us with a very eloquent and a thorough perspective and history of the relations between race, color, capital in South Africa during more than one century, and it's very interesting to see, especially the whole process between 1960 and 1980, 1990, that it's not so well known here in Chile, with all the twists in between, and the influence of Pico as well. I would like now to open the floor to the colleagues and also to the participants from the chat for questions and comments of Professor Dubow's presentation.
Maybe Martin, I could start.
Okay, Christian.
Thank you, Martin and Felipe, for putting together all the technical aspects. And Professor Dubois, I think your presentation was very interesting. And I think there's some ideas that I think it might be useful to clarify, not from you, but in terms of how Chileans have understand and worked on the concept of racial capitalism. To be really honest, I had to explain to Manuel what racial capitalism was. So we have a whole generation of historians that are traditional and have I would say, not to be unfair, a conservative approach to history. So you might be impressed or surprised to know that the term racial capitalism is pretty new in Chilean academia. So when I talked to Manuel months ago about this workshop, it was not an easy task to convince Manuel about the use of racial capitalism in Chile today. Because I think we have, and this is something that I can relate to your presentation right now, we still have this notion that, okay, we live in Chile, neoliberal Chile, and we are part of the world in terms of capitalism, but we think that we have some sort of a colorblind capitalism.
Right.
And that's something you mentioned, not explicitly, but I could understand that in the way in South Africa capitalism has negotiated ways of working with different ethnic groups. And my first question would be, how is that still works in South African society today? Because it doesn't make much sense if you understand how colonialism worked in Africa or in South America or in the Americas, and how some elites today still believe that we can go on with this notion of a colorblind capitalism. So that would be my first question for you.
Well, I mean, it's three questions. So let me say, maybe more. Look, I'd be very interested. I know you're going to be talking about Brazil later, and I would say that there is good reason why many historians are drawn to the comparison between South Africa and Brazil, and fundamentally it comes down to, I suppose, demography. And I think demography is very important. So, if you look, and this is where the sort of settler colonialism things comes into play. If one looks at societies like Australia, for example, where the indigenous peoples are more or less wiped out, not entirely, but it's very significantly denuded. Then the capitalism that develops there, but also in Canada and America is different, but not so different in all parts. Then that demographic difference means that you can imagine thinking about capitalism in non-racial terms. That's not entirely true, even of course, of Australia, because of the White Australia policy. So the more one thinks about it, the more one thinks that, let's reverse this, and can one think of a society in which race or difference or ethnic difference has no influence on the development of capitalism? And I think I would find that quite hard. But I would like to look for other examples from Latin America. So I think that demography is important. Manifestly, the Latin American story with slavery is terribly important to the ideas of Jenkins and Leroy. Now, the other question you ask, I think, and I'm not sure if I entirely understood it, was about South Africa today. And what I find quite interesting is that when I started working on the history of race, I wrote a book in 1995, but it started a long time before that on the history of scientific racism in South Africa. And I had encountered a lot of opposition at the time to even asking the question, because the left, of whom I was part, would say there isn't a problem of race. Race will resolve itself if we can attack capitalism. Well, that manifestly hasn't been the case. And in the modern South Africa, the post-1994 South Africa, everything has become re-racialized. In fact, I don't think I'd be exaggerating all that much if I was to say that race is even more conspicuous in South Africa today than it was in the high point of apartheid. And that was partly because under apartheid, race was so defined and so imposed that is not to say that it wasn't there, but the language that we speak now, the language of colonialism, decoloniality, identity, is much more conspicuous. And it's also part of a general shift in the academy away from interests in structural differences to ideas about identity. And I should also say, and I'm being a little provocative here, that I'm quite struck by the fact that many of the theoretical inspirations for these ideas in South Africa actually come from Latin America. So whereas when I was growing up in South Africa, the Latin American theorists that we were working on were the dependentistas, and which was, very important in the formation of an understanding of South African capitalism. Now it is a later generation of often Latin Americans who live in America, as it happens, who are theorists of colonialism, who really argue that, in a sense, colonialism is something that has happened in this abstract kind of way since the beginning of slavery, since the beginning of occupation, as it were. And I would imagine Chile could not escape that. So I think we're dealing with a number of shifts. There's a demographic angle, but I think there's also a shift in political consciousness and a shift in academic consciousness away from traditional themes of Marxism and exploitation to themes of race and identity, which has taken the debate in very different ways. And economic history, of course, the decline of economic history is part of this process. So I just throw that out, not as a statement of fact, but really as a provocation to see how people respond to that.
Okay. Do we have questions from or comments from the other panelists? Or I can't read, I think I can't read the chat. Felipe, I don't know if in the chat.
I do it, but there's no question for the moment.
No questions for the moment from the chat, no. And okay. Great. So thank you very much, Professor Dubow, for the presentation and also for the comments and the comments after Professor Castro's comments as well. And so now...
Sorry, just to interrupt, there is, in fact, one question on the chat that I can see.
Okay.
But, I mean, maybe there isn't time. I don't know.
No, there... Felipe, I think I don't have access to the chat. Can you read it?
Yes, you do. You have preguntas y respuestas just downside of your screen.
The question is linked to Komarov's missionaries in South Africa, working on to connect villages to make the market either through wage labor or producing for market instead of subsistence.
Yes.
Perhaps it was the relegation of small-scale subsistence agriculture as backwards or useless that helped to create a racialized subject in Southern Africa. This racialized subject then tends to stick to Black South Africans even when they enter market exchanges. That's
right. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the very influential work of the Komarovs, who are anthropologists working in Southern Africa. One of the important things that they showed was that the missionaries, this is an encounter, the missionaries were not just interested in spreading the gospel, but that they were fundamentally involved in modernizing, in modernity. And they do this in very interesting ways. But I think it's not just the Komarovs. It was part of a much longer tradition of rethinking the role of missionaries. And I think, you know, something that you will be familiar with, of course, from Latin America, and the role of Jesuits, different, but not so different. That missionaries in South Africa, or in Southern Africa, in Africa, were not always simply interested in spreading the gospel and saving souls. And there was a recognition quite early on that actually, you know, iconic missionaries like Livingstone, for example, they speak about the 3 C's. I think he spoke about the 3 C's, which was the spread of civilization, capital. He didn't use capitalism, but effectively what the missionaries were saying was that to be effective as a missionary, you had to transform people's lives. You had to transform the people. And one of the ways in which you transformed their lives was to introduce them to the dignity of labor. And so the missionaries were not themselves capitalists, but in many ways they were enabling an industrial system. Just to track back to what I said about Cecil John Rhodes, the key thing that he was involved in, and many of the segregationists, was about saying, look, if we need to break the power of the chiefs in order to extract labor, on what conditions do we do this? And does this mean that actually, as later segregationists argued, that to break the tribal system in order to extract labor actually threatened capitalism itself? And so there's a kind of segmented version in which the let's say the naive Christian view that you needed to destroy African traditions, African cultures, in order to produce modern Christianity, but also an industrial society, could be actually threatening, fundamentally threatening to social stability. So this question that that is raised in the chat is a very, very pertinent one. And I would say that probably you could track in the same way through the migrant labor system a distinction that Cecil John Rhodes himself was keen to establish, is a division between those Africans who are productive peasant cultivators sending their produce to market and indeed to the gold mines and the diamond mines in order to feed this growing population, and Africans who would no longer have access to land, and who would therefore have to go and work in the industrial areas in order to raise their money for their taxes. And the missionaries were very much part of this conversation.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much once again, Professor Dubow. We will now proceed to the presentation of Professor Juan Carlos Medel. He is assistant professor at the Department of History at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago, here in Santiago, Chile. He is a scholar whose research focuses on modern Latin American and Caribbean history and the intersection between historiography and critical theory. He has published articles on the history of the Cuban Revolution, the history of colonialism, and the history of social revolutions. He holds a PhD in history with a designated emphasis in critical theory from the University of California at Davis. And he will, his presentation will deal with racial capitalism and the coloniality of Western democracy. So please, Professor Medel, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to Professor Sol Dubow. Thank you for your very interesting talk and conversation after that. And the title of my talk, which I'm going to read, is Racial Capitalism and the Coloniality of Western Democracy. Decades ago, in a groundbreaking book, the German philosopher Julian Habermas investigated the origins of the public sphere. For him, the public sphere made possible public opinion, and consequently, there we can find the foundation of modern democracy. According to Habermas, we can find this public sphere in places like coffee houses in Paris, London, and the major Italian cities. What Habermas didn't investigate was the origins of that coffee. He didn't pay attention to who produced the coffee beans consumed in Europe, neither did he mention the racial dimension of this product. Habermas' philosophical project was an effort to rescue reason from the radical critique of reason developed by French post-structuralism and later postmodern thought. For Habermas, reason was an essential part of his own philosophical system of communicative action. The German thinker identifies the beginnings of what he calls the subject-centered reason in the Enlightenment. For him, this is precisely where the project of modernity started, at the end of 18th century. For us, following the work of Enrique Dussel, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution are derivative moments in the history of modernity, whose genealogy goes back to 16th century and the conquest of the Americas. Examining the main crossroad of modernity and the construction of a subject-centered reason, which is just another form of instrumental reason, he points to a possibility that was open but not pursued. Habermas, reason as a process of mutual understanding and reciprocal recognition. However, the belief, which was developed by Europeans during the colonial encounter, that native population didn't possess reason, negates this assertion. Habermas follows Hegel in viewing reason as a healing power of unification and reconciliation. Nonetheless, it was Hegel who denied any possible recognition for non-European subjects. Habermas believed in the possibility of rational agreement. The colonial experience denies that possibility. Habermas thought that communicative action was another expression of the Enlightenment. This communicative action would save reason from the radical post-structuralist critique and would be fundamental to reinforce Western democracy at the end of the 20th century. Therefore, Habermas establishes a direct connection between reason, communicative action, and democracy. For him, the problem of modernity was not too much enlightenment, but too little. However, the communicative action that would save democracy from the threat of authoritarianism and the erosion of reason is only possible among equal subjects in a common ground that he calls the public sphere. If communicative action is our paradigm, the rational subject remains now as a citizen, as a participant in social interaction mediated by language. Democracy can be redeemed only through intersubject recognition brought about by the unforced use of reason. The colonial experience demonstrates that the dialogue in equal conditions assumed by Habermas was an impossibility in the Americas. The history of the 20th century exposes the long survival of that impossibility. As a result, the coloniality of Western democracy is a colonial legacy that weighs on the shoulders of our societies. Following this logic, racial capitalism is also the process of building an instrumental reason whose result is a subject-centered reason where the subject is always European. In my interpretation of the meaning of racial capitalism, I understand the concept as an attempt to highlight the racial relation of production at the very heart of modern capitalism. I argue that the trajectories of racial capitalism are the same trajectories of modernity as a project. Indeed, racial capitalism helps explain how fundamental the racialized order was an early project of modernity, despite Habermas' denial of this importance in his celebration of Enlightenment reason. Following Cedric Robinson, I maintain that, I quote, "From its very foundation, capitalism had never been, any more than Europe, a closed system," end quote. What Robinson elaborates as racial capitalism includes the settler colonial dispossession of land and the removal of indigenous people. the colonial slavery that extracted labor from people to whom it denied the category of human beings, and the racialized exploitation of immigrants from around the world. I would argue that the trajectories of racial capitalism go back even further to the historical experience of native peoples in the New World during 16th century. Starting from that experience, I propose an understanding of modernity as a historical process where European colonizers, conquerors and missionaries, Catholic or Protestant, started to define the native population of the New World as an irrational, dangerous subjects. Only after defining the natives, European colonizers began their own definition of themselves as the opposite of what they found in the New World. Therefore, modernity is a project of self-definition developed by European intellectuals of the 16th century, but that process wouldn't be possible without the historical experience of the conquest of the Americas. Then, as Walter Mignolo points out, the colonization of the New World is constitutive of the European project of modernity. It would be inside this project where we can find the origins of modern Western democracy. From this perspective, 16th century becomes a key period to analyze the beginnings of modernity, colonialism, and racial capitalism. Several writers have analyzed this century from different angles. Michel Foucault did it from an epistemological point of view in the late 60s with his book, The Order of Things, using the metaphor of Diego Velázquez and his painting Las Meninas to describe the process and the moment when Europeans develop a more subject-centered representation of the world. As we know, Foucault completely ignored the colonial experience in his analysis of this modern subject and the development of disciplinary societies, even though it was in the colonies where these dynamics took their modern form. Nevertheless, it was thanks to the colonization of the Americas that Europeans started to classify everything that they found in the new continent, making possible the new subject represented in Velázquez's painting. The painter then becomes a metaphor of the European subject who decides to create multiple representation of the natives, assigning a specific place for them in the much bigger picture of an early global world. The aim of Foucault's critique is to strip away the veil of reason, to reveal naked the power it serves. Foucault's analysis takes the form of a genealogical unmasking that reveals the essential intertwinement of knowledge with power. Developing a critical reading of Foucault, Silvia Federici also puts her attention on the 16th century. In her book, Caliban and the Witches, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, she highlights the Native American experience as a key moment in the process of primitive accumulation of modern capitalism, putting women and domestic labor at the center of her argument. According to her main argument, the events in the New World during the 16th century were a fundamental moment in the economic and political takeover by the bourgeoisie, trying to impose a new mode of production with the privatization of property and land, a new system of discipline and rationalizing labor. These new labor routines were resisted by many women, not just in Europe, but also in the New World, releasing the repression of these women through organized witch hunting all over the new territories. Therefore, in her account, the colonial history of the America that started in 1492 also weighs on the foundation of modernity and the articulation of new labor formations, which are the core of racial capitalism. But even more relevant than the contribution named before is the work developed by the Colombian academic Carlos Jauregui in his studies of what he calls cannibalia. The natives, soon reduced to bodies by the European intellectuals and colonizers, became the embodiment of cannibalism, the main expression of non-human behavior in the eyes of the European colonizers. Since then, the cannibal has become a cultural fetish that functions as a counterpoint to the good savage, both complementing each other. Defining the natives as cannibals right away was not related to the consumption of human flesh, but it became a definition for all those natives that resisted the colonial project. In the process of defining the natives as cannibals, the European colonizers defined themselves as the opposite, starting the process of self-definition that we call modernity, intimately connected to the ideology of European humanism. As a result, consumption of bodies and commodities was at the center of the European colonial project in the Americas. The coffee beans ignored by Habermas were not the only commodity produced by forced labor in the Americas. Cotton, cacao, and sugar were also the product of coercive labor formations. Among these commodities, sugar has a special place. Even though it was produced in several places of the New World, it could be a French colony in a Caribbean island where it could become the main commodity that racial capitalism had to offer during 17th and 18th centuries. Saint-Domingue, now called Haiti, was the most important French colony in the Caribbean Sea. The sugar produced by African slaves brought to America after the extermination of the local native population of the island enriched many French families in the colony, but also in the main cities of the metropolis. Majestic palaces were built in Paris with the profits made in Saint-Domingue. Slave labor could be seen in the opulence of the French bourgeoisie. This reality stopped just when the slaves decided to take history on their own hands in the first revolution organized by slaves that the modern world has seen until then. It also became the first new republic in Latin America. But the sugar industry wouldn't stop there. The dynamic of racial capitalism took the business to a place not far from the former French colony. Cuba would become the new center of sugar production. Hundreds of thousands of slaves would be brought to Cuba to supply the much-needed labor that made possible the profit for the slave owners. This time it would be the Spanish colonizer who would organize the exploitation of the black bodies. Moving ahead, even before the mass-scale production of these commodities, mining was an industry with deadly consequences for native population. Gold and silver became the two main commodities at the beginning of the colonization of the New World. Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, was the most important mine in the world during the second part of 16th century. As Jeremy Ravi Manford details in his book Vertical Empire, the general resettlement of Indians in the colonial Andes, Potosí was much more than a mine. It was a complex set of networks connecting Potosí with the main metropolis of Europe, putting the Andean town at the heart of the global capitalism of 16th century. Potosí was not just a relevant part in the periphery of the global market. Potosí was the center of capitalism in the early modern period. To the Spanish, the highlands were the most important region of the Andean settlement. This was not just because they had the densest indigenous population and the traditional center of Inca power, but also because they had the silver mines of Potosí. Already by the mid-16th century, the silver that Andean laborers were extracting was becoming an important source of revenue. For Spanish miners, the encomenderos, who collected tribute from Andean indigenous population, and also for the crown, which collected a 20% tax on all mining activities. In Potosí, the Spanish conquerors, under the leadership of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, reorganized and redefined the mita, an Andean system of labor, changing completely the meaning of labor for the local Andean population. Toledo confirmed, modified, and extended this system, assigning each community a number of laborers, or mitayos, to work at the tambos and in the cities, but especially in the mines. The Spanish colonizers, therefore, were trying to guarantee a surplus of labor to exploit the Andean silver mines. In 1569, the Viceroy ordered more than 1 million native people of the Central Andes to move to newly founded Spanish-style towns called reducciones. This campaign, known as the General Resettlement of the Indians, represented a turning point in the history of European colonialism, a state forcing an entire conquered society to change its way of life overnight. It also represents the very beginnings of racial capitalism in the New World. For the local population, it meant the end of the sense of reciprocity that was an essential component of how they understood their labor activities. More sooner than later, thousands of indigenous started to die as a direct result of the exhausting rhythm of labor imposed over them by the Spanish. It was also a crude example of what Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics, the right to expose other people to death. Mines, encomiendas, plantations were spaces of death long before the factory became the quintessential place of exploitation and hard labor. The colonial experience defines the new territories as spaces where the grotesque and the obscene were two essential characteristics that identify colonial regimes of domination. The cannibal studied by Jauregui and the witches of the New World rescued by Federici are also expression of obscene challenges to colonial power. Therefore, following the history of commodities like sugar, cotton, silver, and coffee, we can see the history of racial capitalism. These commodities hold the historical experience of exploitation, resettlement, and disposal of non-European subjects in the New World. Habermas didn't stop to think about the temporality, spatiality, and the gender dimension behind these kind of commodities, which are usually hidden by the free market and modern capitalism. Habermas agrees with the radical critique of the Enlightenment that the paradigm of consciousness is exhausted. Like them, he views reason as inescapably situated, as concretized in history, society, body, and language. Unlike them, however, he holds that the defects of the Enlightenment can only be made good by further enlightenment. And it is precisely again that idea where the core of our critique stands, our skeptical attitude towards a European construction of reason. For him, the full critique of reason undercuts the capacity of reason to be critical. However, Habermas is still inside the dichotomy of reason and irrationality. He is, after all, another son of the European Enlightenment. His sense of democracy has an undeniable colonial genealogy, no matter if he cannot see it. Starting from this perspective, we can argue that the very origins of the public sphere and modern democracy are a step in a consumer experience only made possible by slavery and other kinds of coercive labor formations. Lisa Lowe, in her book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, highlights the intimacy between everyday practices of consumption by the European bourgeoisie during 18th and 19th centuries and the colonial labor that produced those commodities overseas. That intimacy exposes the inseparability of metropolis and colonies, connecting civilized daily practices with the dehumanization of subjects in the other corners of the world. In her analysis, Lisa Lowe takes the concept of racial capitalism precisely from Cedric Robinson, exposing how the organization, expansion, and ideology of capitalist society was expressed through race, racial subjection, and racial differences. In her view, the concept of racial capitalism captures the sense that contemporary capitalism exploits people of color through socially and culturally constructed differences, such as race, gender, region, and nationality, and exploitation is experienced through those uneven formations. In this way, capitalism is never pure. It is never external to the racial formations of population. Therefore, racial capitalism is also a rejection of the category of abstract labor. Furthermore, racial capitalism suggests that capitalism expands not through rendering all labor, resources, and markets across the world identical, but precisely seizing upon colonial divisions, identifying particular regions for production and others for neglect, certain population for exploitation, and still others for disposal. Habermas, on the contrary, doesn't go beyond acknowledging that modernity bears both developments as well as distortion of reason. Among the former, the developments, he mentioned the universalization of norms and generalization of values, and the growing individuation of personal identities. All prerequisites, according to him, for the effective organization of democratic societies, through which alone reason can, in the end, become practical. Among the latter, the distortions of reason, he focuses on the Holocaust and the violence of World War II. This picture is always centered in Europe, even while making universal claims. All these arguments expose the limitation of his understanding of reason and his idea of democracy. Habermas, like the other thinkers of the Frankfurt School that preceded him, ignores the colonial experience in his analysis of modernity, capitalism, the Enlightenment, and modern democracy. His faith in the universalization of European values exposes the colonial dimension of his thought. His works give us another angle to deconstruct the genealogy of Western democracy, exposing its coloniality that can be found in the very idea of reason that was articulated by the Enlightenment, but whose genealogy takes us back to the 16th century and the colonization of the Americas. As a final thought, only by developing a historical analysis that exposes the problematic origin and genealogy of the political economy of the global north since 1492 can we address the coloniality of modern democracy and the racial dimension of labor, commercial circuits, and commodities of global capitalism. We call the reality and the historical experience racial capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Medel, and I think it's very challenging what you have exposed in the sense of presenting the contrast between the bias of critical thought from Europe and the reality of racial capitalism based on the case of Latin American colonization or colonization here in this part of the world. I would like now to open the floor to questions and comments, both from the presentators of this seminar and also from the participants in the webinar, where there is already also one comment. I may read the comment in the first comment in the chat. It's from Teresa Duran, who is commenting. She says this is an excellent presentation from Professor Juan Carlos, and it is key to recognize the gender. She emphasizes the gender aspects of the colonial and capitalist processes, which are also racialized. That is her comment, more a comment than a question, I think. And
may I just comment on this from the South African or African experience, because it is a very live area of debate and has been for a long time. And I don't know whether the question is familiar with the work of Belinda Bozzoli, B-O-Z-Z-O-L-I, who 50 years ago, actually, because we're having a conference to honor her in Cambridge next month, coined the term of the triple patriarchy of oppression, which was race, class, and gender. And the point that I didn't have time to explicate in my very brief discussion of the migrant labor system is that the people who are responsible for most of the costs of reproduction, both biological reproduction and keeping kids and so forth, are women. So the argument there was that in the migrant labor system of racial capitalism in South Africa, the labor of women and of children was absolutely central to being able to drive down the labor price of men working on the mine. So it's a very important question. And I don't think that South Africa is unique in this way at all.
I would like to comment, following the previous comment by Christian, that for us here in Chile, I think that most of us professors, at least from my generation, we were not trained, to approach the concept of racial capitalism, right? It's still quite new. in our academic world, right, here in Chile, not in the US, right? So it's always kind of like a challenge to grasp the concept, you know, to choose an angle, to go for the concept, you know, and try to understand it, and that situation makes, you know, the analysis of racial capitalism, at least in this part of the world, a little more diffuse, I guess, than the situation in other countries and other universities, right? And for that reason, I think that one possible way to approach the concept of racial capitalism is precisely the history of commodities, right? Which are basically we could say, you know, the embodiment of racial labor, you know, and that is what I'm trying to do. And in that logic, you know, my main goal is not a critique of Habermas, and that is what I want to precise, right? It's not necessarily a critique of Habermas. I just use Habermas to basically approach Western democracy. That would be my main goal, right? To try to elaborate, you know, an exploratory critique of Western democracy as a legacy of racial capitalism, or the history of racial capitalism. And that would be the connection that I'm trying to do, you know, using Habermas as an instrument, I guess, or a gate, right, a door to approach the colonial legacy of Western democracy.
Great. Here we have more, I think, another comment here in the chat. Teresa Duran clarifies her previous comment, saying she was meaning, she was referring to the high rate of rape. And on the other hand, Nicolas Gomez, I will read his comment. He says, "Thank you very much for the presentations and conversation. I agree with Professor Medela about commodities, and I would think that it is an important regional approach in Latin America rather to think only in the national boundaries, an old and long-lasting discussion." Right?
Yeah.
So that is an additional complementary comment. So, okay, we have no more comments in this moment. We can we will proceed with the third presentation of this seminar. Our next presenter is Professor Claudio Javier Barrientos. He is a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and associate professor in history of Latin America and Chile at the Diego Portales University. His research interests are memory, indigenous rights, gender, gay, and LGBTQ studies. Professor Barrientos will talk us about racial capitalism, land dispossession, and global extractivism versus indigenous rights in Latin America. Professor Barrientos, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning. Can you all hear me? Oh, perfect. Because I was having trouble with my audio last week, so I was kind of worried. Thank you for the invitation, and I have to confess that I might be part of the generations of Chilean students who never studied racial capitalism before, but it's been a real challenge to address this issue and to get familiar with some of the literature related to this field, to this very new field and historiographical debate. And so I'm gonna start my presentation. And I'm gonna read it also because my English might not be as accurate as I want to. So I'm gonna read my presentation. When Martin Legacy and David Hampson wrote Foreign Investment in the Reproduction of Radical Capitalism in 1976, they called for attention for the flow of international capitalism. They called for the attention, that the flow of international capitalism could not subvert the apartheid state and replace it with normative and efficient modern capitalist relations. This concept does not imply that racism is prior or nor constitutive of the development of capitalism, but it operates alongside capitalism. Racial differences and racialized forced labor were essential factors in forming radical capitalism. Modern capitalism and working classes have been built on the obliteration of racial and ethnic differences among classes. Historians have used the concept of racial capitalism to explain how racism and capitalism are intertwined in long-term historical processes. However, it is essential to step into the cycles of violence, forced displacement, and dispossession that seem to be in the core formation of the transatlantic world, where slavery and the shape of dark proletariat were at the center of the violent construction of primitive accumulation and capital. These processes explain and describe the long-term formation of capital in modern societies. Therefore, we need to reflect on how specific processes of violence and land disposition have affected indigenous societies in the Americas and how they have shaped the dynamics of modern capitalism. However, colonialism, as we have seen in the previous two presentations, have also been crucial to land grabbing, forced displacement, and exploitation of natural resources based on racial violence against the African descent population and indigenous communities in the Americas. Currently, 50% of the American natural resources still sits on lands traditionally owned, occupied, or stewarded by indigenous people. This situation has considered indigenous politics and resistance to global capitalism and extractivism. This presentation proposes to discuss indigenous anti-capitalist and decolonization politics on land and natural resources in Latin America as a counterpart of racial capitalism in the region. Recent contributions to critical ethnic studies have used the concept of racial capitalism and violent processes and all the violence processes involved in primitive accumulation and the separation of social forces theorized by Marx to analyze the new indigenous movements in the Americas in the assertion of land and collective rights. And I will try to follow this train of thought from cases basically based on Chile, but also I will refer to Bolivia and Ecuador. Capitalist modernity in the Americas is based on institutionalized or state-fostered violence against indigenous communities. As we have said, this process of capitalist development occurred under the display of land taking and forced displacement of the indigenous population. The closest and most evident example for me is Chile. Chilean white narratives of the 19th century state that indigenous territory was integrated into the national economy and second cycle of capitalism to provide goods and supplies to the nitrate mining regions taken from Peru and Bolivia in the last decades of the 19th century. However, we can argue that these territories were never fully integrated into the Chilean capitalist production, capitalist mode of production. Capital expanded to these regions and developed through settlements and foreign colonization. The politics of resettlements of Mapuche people, the main indigenous group in our country, reduced and forcibly moved the indigenous population to a 5% of the land they used to have before the war with the Chilean state. In 1930, Southern land property law consolidated the abuses by colonizers and landowners who had expanded their state's limits into indigenous communal properties. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, impoverishment of the indigenous communities forced people to migrate to the cities to look for employment and semi-paid jobs that would allow them to survive. Land reform under President Allende was a moment of radicalization among indigenous communities in recuperation of land and their communities. However, the most violent measure against Mapuche people was the implementation of the DFL, which is Decree with Force of Law, number 2568 of 1978, that was implemented in 1979, which divided communal lands, communal title of lands that were given before in the end of the 19th century in the process of resettlement of indigenous communities. So this decree with the law enforcement of 1979 divided communal lands in the Araucanía and eliminated the concept of indigenous land from legal documents and titles of property over former indigenous land titles. Indigenous movements mightily resisted this measure because this decree did not just divide communal lands into small individual states, but eliminated or legally erased the existence of indigenous land, attacking not only indigenous access to land, but also erasing and separating the two main elements of indigenous identity, the existence and the material reality of indigenous land. This decree, imposed by Pinochet, by the former dictator Augusto Pinochet, moved rapid radicalization and decolonization among indigenous political groups, articulating a new form of indigenous national identity. What is the relation of this brief history with racial capitalism? Indigenous radicalization, anti-capitalism, and anti-colonial struggle are linked to a century of land dispossession and exploitation that ended reinstalling in the sociopolitical discourses of national identity and resistance to what they have called global capitalism and global racism in their own discourses. The struggle against global capitalism and global racism focus on the effects of law, also of another law, not just this decree 2568 of 1978, but also a previous law, number 701, promulgated in the earliest stages of implementation of the dictatorship economic design in 1974. In the middle of the counter-agrarian reform that gave back expropriated land states in the Araucanía to former landowners, and which ruled the logging industry and regulated the species of trees used in reforestation and recuperation of the mountains forestry. Most of the boycotts and damage that radical indigenous insurgency had implemented in the 1990s, challenged the logics of the forest and logging industry extractivism. In this sense, the 701 law and the decree 701 law from 1974 and the decree number 2568 of 1978 have oriented indigenous struggles into a two combined and parallel trends of anti-racial capitalism dynamics and anti-extractivist practices in global capitalism and national colonialism in Chile. On the one hand, the decree 2868 originated the reunification of national identity movements that started in the 1980s with the movement at Mapu and radicalized indigenous movements, further indigenous movements in the 80s and 90s. On the other hand, the effects of 701 law in the logging industry and reforestation became visible in the 1990s and 2000s when reforestation with non-native species like pine trees and eucalyptus damaged and destroyed the soils of the mountains and have become, in our days, under global warming threats, a fertile terrain for forest fires. Initial logging industry projects and reforestation projects in the 1980s and 1990s offered to become points of economic development and employment. However, they have become areas of racial and ethnic violence that have displaced people from ancestral lands. They have impoverished peasant and indigenous population, forbidden the use of natural resources, such as water and wood. Indigenous movements have developed a political and anti-neoliberal resistance based on the premise that global capitalism, profits, and accumulation are based on local racial exclusionary violence against the indigenous population. Geographical areas of southern Chile, therefore, have become places where local communities have been encapsulated among big logging industries, with forest workers from outside the region and the communities, and they have been threatened and harassed by private security officers paid by logging enterprises and also military police imposed by the state. In that sense, as in other places in Latin America, global extractivism industries have become points of a new form of authoritarian company towns and violent lands for indigenous communities and peasant populations. This situation illustrates how in Latin America, local expressions of global capitalism have become war zones where violence has become racially based and radical mobilization have become racialized. In other areas of South America, such as in Ecuador, Tia Rio-Franco has pointed out how indigenous movements have developed a new form of ecological radicalism called resourced radicalism, in which activists had to develop a new discourse of anti-capitalism and anti-extractivism in the period of Rafael Correa, who reacted against these movements, arguing that in any anti-capitalist discourse, not even in Marxism, there wasn't any argument related to natural resources, at least not how indigenous movement expressed the political and cultural importance of natural resources. Oil and mining extractivism in Ecuador did not consider all the ecological side effects of land, forests, and water surrounding the indigenous communities. Neither the leftists nor the Korea government could see how modernity, fair payments, and jobs could have become a problem of subsistence and survival for indigenous communities. In Bolivia, in the Chaco region, and especially in the Guarani region, according to Brett Gustafson, almost in the outskirts of the nation and the national territory, the second nationalization of the gas industry under President Evo Morales and mass movement did not mean national management of the resources. The state reinforced the non-public property of the gas. However, exploitation was in charge of the transnational and global companies. Indigenous communities became impoverished and contaminated by the gas industry. Their lands eroded and their economic cycles were affected or disarticulated by the lack of access to natural resources like water. Different forms of radical extractivism have produced also different movements and resistance that have become discourses of resource radicalism. However, these forms of resource radicalism embrace and make explicit how nowadays local expressions of global capitalism still hold in their exploitation practices forms of violence that are inherently linked to racial and ethnic violence and logic of primitive accumulation, even in not just in Chile in the transition to democracy, but also even in progressive and leftist governments such as Correa in Ecuador and in Bolivia with MAS. So this is more presentation in terms of, and you can discuss further topics and the questions. I can hear anyone.
Sorry.
Okay.
Enough. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Barrientos, for your presentation here. And so now, please, the floor is open to questions and comments from the colleagues and also from the chat. Mm-hmm.
There's a comment on the chat.
That's that. Yes. Okay. Okay. So
Excellent.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Teresa. She's local. She's local, though.
local. Okay. Okay. Anyhow, the yes. Is there's an additional comment?
Yeah, there's an additional comment.
There is a ads. There is a Duran ads that this brings her to consider the issue of climate change as well.
Yeah, totally. Well, climate change is a big part of new discourses and new strategies of resistance and anti-capitalist movements in Latin America among indigenous communities. So it's interesting how they have racialized and ethnicized their discourses towards global warming, and how global warming they perceive it as part of global capitalism and what they call also global racism, because they are the more affected ones by global warming. Professor
Professor Dubois?
Thank you. I was very interested in what you had to say. I would just wonder whether, and I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, I'm just wondering whether there isn't a slippage between talking about race and talking about indigenous people. The question is, doesn't one have to consider how indigenous peoples are racialized before you can simply use them as a kind of synonym?
Yeah, it's not. I don't think there's a synonym. There are different forms of adaptation of race, and the peculiarity of the similarity of discussing the case of Chile and all the cases in the Southern Cone is basically that is very hard to consider the category of race just in terms of black and white, or just in terms of African descent, or the cycles of the history of the transatlantic history of the transatlantic forced displacement of people, white slavery. In terms of race and ethnicity, in the case of Chile, especially with indigenous movements, they have been racialized through different political categories, and different forms of repression that are only applied to indigenous people, like the current anti-terrorist law and the category of terrorism. In Chile, the category of terrorism is there are different kind of categories to classify someone as terrorist, but during the 2000s and the second decade of this century, terrorism was mainly a racialized category used for indigenous activists and for indigenous political movements. And there's a very interesting job done by Patricia Richards in those terms, when in a book called Racism. She dedicates several chapters just to interviewing people from different parts of the Chilean society, and especially from different parts of the indigenous society and in the Araucanía. And she can identify all these positionalities of the word terrorist. And this word terrorist have become in the Araucanía as a racialized concept, just to refer to indigenous activism, or to identify forms of indigenous violence. And in that way, they have been racialized. But in the other way, I'm not saying they have implemented a racial discourse. I think they are anthropologists and social scientists have said that the process of indigenous movement, the race of indigenous movement, especially in Chile, is a process that is it has a long historical development. Most people it identified indigenous radicalization with the 1990s and the 2000s. However, indigenous radicalization started at the end of the 1970s and in the 1980s when they articulated a discourse of national identity and decolonization. They identify as part of all the decolonization processes in the third world at the moment, like in the Caribbean or even Africa and Asia. They try to find links to the national liberation discourses. And in that way also, they have achieved a different, very specific concept of race that is mixed with their own ethnicization process in which they have reconstructed the language, they have deconstructed national identity, and they are also reconstructing different forms of indigenous territory, not just the physical material indigenous territory in the indigenous region, but also other places where they have migrated. And their ethnic identity has become an important part of new forms of urban and different forms of territories that are connected to the Araucanía. So those are different processes. They have been racialized by the state. They have been racialized by the Chilean legislation and the military police, but they have ethnicized themselves, reconstructing themselves in terms of a new national project, which is different. And so those are different processes that combine and link themselves into this whole context of global capitalism that they also call global racism. They call it global racism as a form of identifying that global capitalism, new forms of capitalism and extractivism especially are specifically directed and specifically affecting indigenous communities as a racial group. And it doesn't affect equally. You know, one of the major, I'm not an expert as you guys in racial capitalism, but what I've in the literature is that one of the main qualities of this concept is that you can differentiate different forms of proletariat. You can differentiate different forms of working classes, and in those terms, I think indigenous movements have been very smart in terms of identifying that they are a racialized specific group that it's being specifically affected by the forms in which global capitalism and global extractivism is working. And it's interesting because although it is a global phenomenon, and although one might think it's a very contemporary process, they also understand this process as a national and global process of colonialism. They do not separate it. I don't think they separate global capitalism from colonialism. And I think that's where these categories kind of intertwine, and this and these discourses also kind of mingle in a new form of radicalism. That'll be.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Barrientos, for your presentation and also for your comments. I would like now to introduce Professor Cristian Castro. He is PhD in history from the University of California, Davis. His areas of interest include the history of Brazil, the transnational history of the Americas during the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of Afro-descendants in the Americas, and cultural history. He is currently the director of the Department of History at the Diego Portales University, and he will present us an exposition regarding the colonial roots of Brazil's racial capitalism. Please, Professor Castro, the floor is yours. You need to...
Thank you so much, Martin. Let me just start by saying that we all probably have our obsessions. Mine is the press. And since I got back from the US, I've been reading Chilean press, of course, and have very bad opinion about the quality of our journalism and the way we communicate the history of other countries in Chile. So my way of approaching this workshop was to try to communicate how in Chile we understand Brazilian politics. And not only Chile, but other parts of the world tend to oversimplify the history of Brazil and fail to connect that history to current events. So I'll go straight to the paper. I will also read because my English is a little rusty, and I might go on and on and on if I improvise. One of the great books to approach the history as a discipline is The Use and Abuse of History, or How the Past is Taught to Children, by the recently deceased French historian Marc Ferrand. With a simple but powerful premise, Ferrand explains how the images or stories told us as children remain hegemonic in our understanding of the past, and therefore condition our diagnosis about the present and our expectations about the future. As is supposed, this logic works for our national histories, but it also works with the images we build on the histories of other nations. This construction of another becomes an indispensable counterpart to perform the mirror exercise of self-definition by contrast, aiming to reaffirm our self-perception as a nation. In short, although it sounds paradoxical, we are also what we are not or do not want to be. In this respect, Brazil seems to occupy a special place in our global imagination. We argue that history of Brazilian racial capitalism has fueled our perceptions of Brazil racially, socially, culturally, and politically. Although the ordinary global citizen has a scarce and superficial notion of the history of Brazil, we have one meridian certainty. Most imagined communities do not want to have their history so profoundly connected to the history of slavery, as is the case of Brazil. Following Ferrand, the history of Brazilian racial capitalism is hardly told to the children and young people, but we all have a place for Brazil in our global imagination. That place is intimately connected to slavery and Blackness. The narratives that have built that global cultural repertoire associated with Brazil may or may not be based on historical research. However, it is undoubtedly related to the media, news, or other cultural products that have informed that repertoire. On the other hand, news networks around the globe have, in most cases, misinformed about Brazilian political situation, limiting their analysis to global trends on neoconservatives and the rise of the right-wing nationalism, connecting Bolsonaro with, for example, Donald Trump, but have failed to connect it with the local and racial histories of Brazil. Brazil's long political history has its roots in the courts of the Portuguese Empire. Then, due to the Napoleonic invasions of the Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal, the king and part of the court would move to Brazil. This colony would eventually acquire a co-imperial status. From then on, Brazil would have a slightly different trajectory from the rest of South America, including its independence process and the Republic's founding. Lula and Bolsonaro's Brazil results from these different social processes rooted in a racial hierarchy inherited from the country's colonial beginnings and the superstructure ideology that permitted the economic system of slavery. A third of the slave trafficking that crossed the Atlantic reached its shores. That is why when we imagine Brazil, we imagine it as a Black nation. Its history is closely linked to the racial architecture that sustains its economy and phenotypically divided its population into whites, blacks, mulattoes, browns, caboclos, just to name a few categories. Slavery and the whole social order it involved was a substantial part of its society, and its importance was such that just a year after slavery was abolished, there was a change in the political system that ended the monarchy and founded the new republic. From the end of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, Brazil went through different historical processes that are all connected somehow to their racial relations. Public policies that attempted to whiten the nation by importing European migrants, territorial expansion, rural city migration processes, and planned urbanizations that saw the emergence of favelas, industrialization, populism, a coup d'etat, and the redemocratization process after dictatorships. The main objective of the following lines is to expand our elements of analysis on the history of Brazil that may complement the other accounts that we have heard about Brazil. Although not all the historical factors that are important today in Brazil can be covered in such short lines, and I'm thinking about religion or Protestantism, for example, I hope that these lines will serve to provide other elements of analysis in the current historical moment, and in particular, to rethink the importance of the different regional areas in the construction of what we call the Brazilian public sphere. From this diagnosis, we propose to present the audience with three tropes that are closely linked. The Northeast as a geographical and symbolic space. That's the first one. Racial democracy as the constructive discourse of the nation. And in third term, Sao Paulo as a space of economic and social power within the geographies of racial capitalism in Brazil. In this regard, a perspective that takes into account the region of Brazil delivers a historical, more informed look at the present. We are not faced with a classic right versus left dichotomy, but a more complex scenario where it is impossible to avoid taking into account the racial relations and their trajectories in the different moral economies that generated it, such as the sugar economy in the Northeast, the coffee plantation complex in the vicinity of Sao Paulo, or the livestock economy of the South. So I'll start with Nordeste. First, one must point out that to understand Brazil better, one of its main characteristics is its cultural and geographical diversity, which makes it a nation that falls into the category of a continent country. In the same territory coexist traditions as diverse as the Gaúcho, Baiana, Paulista, Carioca, Nordestina, or Amazona. Each region has its demographic equation, historically conditioned by the economy of its area, producing its own elite and its own internal logic. We could argue that Brazil, from within, was a kind of federalism waiting to happen. The existence of different regional economic developments and their corresponding elites that would push different agendas generated the need for a government that did not fall into the vices of centralism. If we had to choose a region, the Northeast is an ideal example of understanding the importance of history in explaining the electoral dynamic of current politics. Indeed, of the 5 zones that divide Brazil, North, Northeast, Central West, Southeast, and South, Lula da Silva only won in the Northeastern region, with the 69% of the votes. However, the result was strong enough to offset the defeats in other regions. It was that region when, in the 17th century, the economic need for the import of slave labor from Africa resulted from the price of sugar. From this geo-historical context, a structural feature of Brazil's demography begins to shape. The association between the Northeast and Blackness. Its cultural capital, Salvador de Bahia, is also known for being the Black metropolis of the country. Moreover, it is no coincidence because it is precisely in that area of Brazil which is the closest to Africa. It is therefore acknowledging how racism has fueled public policies around the globe. It is not surprising that the Northeast has historically been the country's poorest and most backward sector. Over the time, not only this economic region support the sugar economic development with the use of slavery, but this region would also be the cradle of the ideological superstructure that would justify it. Colonial racialized hierarchies operated in those long-lasting mental structures that would only change slowly, if any. Therefore, once slavery was abolished in 1888 and the Republic was established in 1889, the Northeast region would not only be associated with poverty, but also from that point on with backwardness and ignorance. That same Northeast was the geography that determined the history of Canudos, a locality in which Antonio Conselheiro, a sort of rebellious prophet, formed a community of millennial followers that at the end of the 19th century rebelled against the modernizing world that was changing rapidly. The end of slavery and the monarchy and the birth of the Republic fueled catastrophic discourses that catalyzed the popular movement. Rio de Janeiro, the center of the power in those years, did not see with good eyes the behavior of fanatics that were labeled as wild, and that had followers that could even confront the military sent from Rio. The so-called War of Canudos, which Mario Vargas Llosa wrote a book, La Guerra del Fin del Mundo, was a massacre. The dramatic result of one of the multiple phases of Brazilian modernization in which part of its population suffered the outbursts of an elite who was afraid of these pockets of pre-modernity that, according to Rio de Janeiro, delayed the country into the international race toward progress. Undoubtedly, it is an extraordinary story, the story of Canudos, that reflects one of the most prominent cross-cutting historical nodes of our continent. The encounter between the modernizing elites of Eurocentric ideology with a reality that, from the perspective of the latter, resembled more the definition of barbarism than that of civilization. The image of the backward Northeast would be consolidated in the 19th century with the elites that tried to rethink the cluster narratives. Thus, the Northeast was reinvented as a space that marginalized and stereotyped its inhabitants, and its sole presence in a way strained the coherence and modernity of the nation. It is a critical space when deconstruction was what regionalism meant in Brazilian tradition. However, it is important not to remain there. The Northeast, particularly Recife, Pernambuco, was home to one of the most significant responsibles for the founding of the myth that we all have when we think about Brazil. And that person was Gilberto Freire. A historian, sociologist, anthropologist, and writer, became one of the greatest interpreters of Brazil during the 20th century, which was vital in building the image of a country of Brazil in the world. his most significant intellectual contribution is linked to the concept of racial democracy, where he developed a way of understanding Brazil. Racial democracy. The best trick the devil invented was to convince the world that it did not exist. It's a quote from the 19th century poet Charles Baudelaire, and popularized by the character Kaiser Soze in Quentin Tarantino's The Usual Suspects. Something similar has happened in Brazil with racism. For many people in different parts of the world, Brazil is a synonym with racial democracy, a geo-historical place where racism did not seem to operate, in contrast to other societies. This historical process was not a notion of a spontaneous crystallization. Seeking to overcome the phase of blanqueamiento, the widening of the nation, the country intended to import poor Europeans to replace slave labor. Gilberto Freire offered a new solution to the racial problem of Brazil, based on a narrative of unity with a clustering and nation-building discourse. In Casa Grande e Sensata, Freire argues that Brazil is an ethnic result of an equation composed by three elements: Portuguese, Africans, and indigenous, who would have generated a cultural amalgam different from the rest of the world. And among their peculiarities, it is that the Brazilians are read as less racist due to the Portuguese mental amplitude. People historically accustomed to others, such as Portuguese traveling to Africa or Asia. The comparative advantage of Brazil offered to the world was the mix that generated a non-racist society. Gilberto Freire's thought became important during the Estado Novo, where Getulio Vargas was in power from 37 to 45. However, it was and still is an ideology in a large that is successful in a large part of the population, including and this is paradoxical, Afro-descendants who have used the logic of racial democracy for their own agenda, which is very complicated to explain. The genius of the idea that Brazil was a racial democracy is that it eliminates the problem that made the need to create palliative public policies in other parts of the world. So if we have the Nordeste and we have racial democracy, we also need to talk about a contrast. In this case, is a geo-historical space. In the case of Brazil, is Sao Paulo. Suppose there is a Brazilian imagination of, if we suppose that there is a Brazilian imagination linked to a backward Northeast, there's also another Brazil that needs to be taken care of. Sao Paulo, a city that crystallized modernity in Brazil, a town that does not wait for anyone in the quest for progress. They have this logic that kind of connects to New York in a sense. While Sao Paulo did not have the history of other capitals of the country, like Salvador de Bahia or Rio de Janeiro, the economic boom of the coffee during the 19th century gave Sampa, as the locals know it, the place of privilege in the national history. Sao Paulo was, during the turn of the century and the first decades of the 20th century, the engine of the country's economy, and the only Brazilian city that managed to reach the levels of industrial and cultural development that placed Sao Paulo in the heights of cities like Chicago, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, or other First Nations metropolis. For this reason, studying the history of Sao Paulo in this period is studying urban modernity in general. Several specialists have mapped the origin and race of modern thought in that region, examining changes in the cultural life through the analysis of urban everyday life, public policies, or the role of intellectuals. Sao Paulo offered the opportunity to enter modernity through the main door for Brazilians. Their elite understood that the slave order should be replaced by another kind of hegemony, not only economic, but also cultural. In this way, Sao Paulo put himself at the forefront of rethinking the country and its narratives, as happened in the famous Week of Modernity in 1922. The foundation of different newspapers in the same area, and the creation of an institution of excellence, such as the University of Sao Paulo in the 30s. Under the motto, Ciencia vinces, sciences wins, the University of Sao Paulo represented the crystallization of a new and more sophisticated form of symbolic concrete domination of the Paulista elite over the rest of the country. From the University of Sao Paulo, this elite would have several goals: mapping, understanding, and controlling the national territory, creating a new elite that would transfer its ideology to the middle classes through the production of secondary teachers, and studying and monitoring the new masses of domestic and foreign migrants who arrive in the city as a result of the rapid process of industrialization experienced by Sao Paulo since the beginning of the 20th century. Everything that came after worked according to the plan of the Paulista elites. During the 20th century, Sampa would consolidate its economic and symbolic power over the nation, and its industrialization would make it one of the two largest cities in Latin America, alongside with Mexico City. If there's one city that can be associated with development in Brazil, it is Sao Paulo. And in the recent election, Jair Bolsonaro won in Sao Paulo with 54% of the voters. Lula and Bolsonaro, I'm wrapping up. Go with me. Today's Brazil is not just the result of the struggle between neoconservatives, populism against the historic leader of the Workers' Party. The present situation is also the result of long social processes that directly inform the present. The construction of Brazilian racial capitalism, with its various variants, have existed in the country since its origins, and has profoundly marked its society, and is a historical factor that must be considered. Lula and Bolsonaro do not have the same skin color, and that fact in Brazil has a history. Explaining more of that history or story is necessary because it provides more elements of analysis to understand the present. Such a perspective allows us to understand better the link between slave societies and the emergence of political figures as Jair Bolsonaro or Donald Trump. There is a tendency in our national media to rest their analysis in easy and quick responses. Most media consumers have positioned the recent election from the same extremely presentist perspective. The question, does anti-PT or anti-Bolsonarism explain per se all the long, medium, and short-term social processes the country has experienced and has today faced with that sort of dichotomy? Although there is an insistence on reducing the discussion between conservatives and left-wing neopopulisms, a quick analysis of the latest electoral data shows that racist logic still operates in Brazil today, where the slave Northeast turned into black, poor Northeasterns who still vote for the left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Castro, for providing us this perspective of racial capitalism in Brazil and its history, a history that normally we ignore, and showing how this recent electoral competition is not something that was just born yesterday. No, that it really has its profound roots in the division of Brazil, both racial and regional. And I would like now to open the floor for questions and comments from the participants of the seminar, both in the screen and in the chat. So the floor is open to questions and comments. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Christian. If you could elaborate the difference, if there are differences, and I suppose that there are, in this kind of like regional approach that you have for Brazil, right? How relevant is the Northeast, right? And the differences with the South and specifically Sao Paulo. And of course, made me think about the different regions in the United States, right? The South and the North in the United States. So in this context, or coming, from the concept of racial capitalism, what would be the difference in the dynamics between the relationship between the Northeast in Brazil and Sao Paulo, and on the contrary, in the US, the South, right, and the industrial North of the United States? I'm thinking mostly, in terms of political differences, as well as culturals.
That's a great question. I think that the U.S. has also obviously a history of racial capitalism, and it's linked to politics. I was living in the U.S. when Barack Obama was elected, and in the U.S. public sphere, that was huge. They constructed this idea, which was false, that they had entered this sort of stage of colorblind democracy just to because they elected Obama, they surpassed racism. I don't know. Anyway, so after Obama was in power, and the world was shocked by the election of Trump. When you start reading about it, and when you read journalisms and historians, you realize that the election of Donald Trump was intimately linked to Obama. I'm pretty sure that there is a connection on racial relations, on how the country, the US, saw the election of a first Black president, and how part of the society reacted to that when he was in power. Part of Trump's discourse was fueled by this sense of a middle class that wanted to have a better position in society, and this was a white middle class. And part of his voters were openly racist. So I think there's a long story of racial relationships in the US that divided the country in the 19th century from South that was connected to slavery, and the North that wanted to end slavery. And there's all sorts of images about that dichotomy, but that historical past, I believe, still informs U.S. politics today, and to some extent, that regional history is also, as is in the case of Brazil, has also a pretty central role in politics in the US today. Race is still there. It's maybe not the elephant in the room anymore, but it's still there, and it's also based on regional history. So it's a complicated question, but I think there's a connection there, and it's pretty big. And on the other hand, when I was presenting, I was mentioning neoconservatives, and I linked that to what Professor Dubois presented at the beginning of the workshop. We tend to believe that colorblind societies can exist, and that's a lie. And that's also one way that neoconservatives have tried to construct their narratives that led them to power. So yes, there's huge similarities between how race plays a role in politics in Brazil and the US, I guess.
Martin, there's a comment and a question on the chat. So
Yes. Okay. So it's the comment is from Laura Tabolaki. As I understand, addressed to Professor Dubois. And then there's a comment by Daniel Silva. Since the comment of Daniel Silva is directly addressed to the present presenter, to Professor Castro, I will start with Daniel Silva's question: is how prevalent is racial capitalism, or where can it be observed in the presidential speeches of Brazil?
Wow. I assume Daniel is talking about Lula or Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was openly racist. He didn't have any problem talking about slavery and its modern manifestations of blackness and poor people. And I believe that one way to understand how Bolsonaro took care of his speeches was to ignore Afro-Brazilians to the most part. And I don't think he was not trying to hide it. I think he understood that trying to overcome that past linked to slavery was not to even mention it. And I think you can see that in different societies where when history becomes an issue, people just don't talk about it and just present their narratives regarding the future. Lula da Silva, on the other hand, he is more open about taking care of historical differences between different ethnic groups in Brazil. And he, in his first period as a president, he came out with public policies like fomicero, as no more hungry people. And he knew he was constructing that public policy for Blacks, for Afro-Brazilians, because he's conscious about that Northeast I just mentioned. So I think there's a difference between the way Bolsonaro wrote his speeches and Lula. And that's why I use that phrase from Baudelaire and later used with the usual suspects. The best trick of the devil is just to make people believe that he doesn't exist. That's one way of understanding how Bolsonaro saw racism.
Yes. Thank you. Now, we can move to the question by Laura or comment by Laura Tabolacci. addressed to Professor Dubow, where, oops, it just erased from my chat, at least. I don't know.
For mine too. Yeah, it's not there.
It's not there anymore. Yeah.
No, you have to go to
It's
the
there.
answered. You have to go to
Yeah.
the answered
You have to click
section
the
at the
answer,
middle,
but
and it's at the bottom of the
To the
chat.
Where is it? In the
At the bottom of the chat, in the answer section, at the middle of the chat.
You have open or
okay, yeah,
and then
sure, yeah, right.
that's
the
because
new version of Zoom seems to mean that when a question is answered, it's no longer a question, which I think
No
is
longer a question. Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, maybe it would be nice anyway, anyhow, to read the question and the answer here. Okay. I will take a minute on that. Laura Tabulakias Debo, she commented saying, I do indeed think the question is worthy, but more in terms of thinking how they influence one another. I suppose I'm a bit wary of the question because of problems in US politics, but in trying to consider your point, I wonder if Polanyi's idea of a society being embedded in the economy under capitalism can be useful with this question. Maybe modifying Polanyi's ideas a bit, this doesn't necessarily privilege capitalism, materialism, the economy, over race, but that it explains how racial categories form out of the economy at the same time as feeding it. This, of course, then explains why racial categories always change and the creative destruction of capitalism as it finds new ways to exploit. I add one thought, thinking about the British reconquest of Ireland, especially in the 16th century, and the racializing of the Irish as primitive, pastoralist, helping to provide a racial capitalism aspect to Polanyi's arguments about the development of capitalism in Britain. And the answer of Professor Dubow is thinking about this, Laura. Polanyi was an influence on my understanding of the idea of economic subject, but that was long time ago. I do agree that the important question is how race and capitalism are mutually constitutive and how the relationship changes over time. The Irish example is interesting, but maybe has more to do with the development of scientific racism in the second half of the 19th century. I don't think Cromwell needed to use race. Religion was ample in the 17th century. Thank you very much also, Professor Dubow, for the answer, and Laura for raising the question of the problem. And I would like to now ask if there are additional questions for Professor Castro or for the panelists in general before closing or wrapping or closing this.
I want to follow the question to Christian. Let me be a little more specific, right? In this comparison that is, I know it's pretty easy, right? Between the North in Brazil that have slavery in the past, right? And the South that is supposed to be industrial, right? And a similar dynamic in the United States, but from the South to the North. So beyond the similarities, right, that there are there, my question is if you think that there is some particular differences between the relationship in this comparison, between the relationship between the North and the South in Brazil and the South and the North in the United States. And I know that there are probably many differences, right, and in terms of the particularities of each country. But the question is, do you think that there is one or some specific differences that are structural that would make a very important difference between both countries?
Yes, the basic difference it's Gilberto Freire. The notion that Brazil has this difference with the rest of the world because they have racial democracy was an ideology that permitted Brazilian elites to group different ethnic groups and try to construct a nation that was different from the rest of the world. In the case of the US, they did not do that. And I think they had, for instance, Jim Crow, with a public policy that divided the people between blacks and whites. And that was a crystallization of an ideology. So you had cities divided in two. That never happened in Brazil, not because racism didn't exist, but because the elites managed to work out a different way of construction a nation and taking care of race at the same time. So I believe that the difference that you're looking for are those, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor Dubois, yes.
Yeah, no, Christian, I was again learned a lot from your discussion. The only thing I would like to ask you is a question for clarification in your use of the term racial democracy, because we've used the term racial capitalism, of course, and I used the term racial liberalism, both of which signal the idea that these two concepts are inseparable. In other words, you can't talk about liberalism without race, you can't talk about capitalism without race. But I wonder whether that's the meaning that you ascribe to racial democracy, because my understanding of Freire is that, you know, he was a eugenicist who managed to redescribe eugenic ideas to say that Brazil was a special mixture of different races where race no longer mattered. Now, the question is that a racial democracy? And many people argue these days that democracy cannot be separated from race, because there are very few examples where you can find that democracy does not also constitute the other as not belonging to the democratic order, starting, if you like, with the Greeks and going all the way through to America, choose your pick, Israel. So when you say racial democracy, do you mean racial democracy or non-racial democracy?
When I used the term racial democracy in this presentation was the way Freire used it.
No, I understand that. I'm just wondering whether, in the context of the discussions we're having today, where we're putting these concepts together, whether you can actually use the Freire concept without qualifying it.
Oh yeah, you're right. I think you need to criticize it, and if I didn't do that explicitly, I should have. Racial democracy was used by Freire in the 30s as a result of world politics, I guess. But today, and only after in the 50s and 60s, when Marxists challenged the concept, it started to be criticized, but it still works. So it's a complicated question, because part of the population in Brazil still believe in the original sense of the term racial democracy.
Yes.
And actually, Afro-Brazilians used it in the 50s or 60s just to get a better place in Brazilian society with their own agendas, challenging the state, saying, okay, we're a racial democracy, prove it. So I think the term has developed a historical trajectory, and today nobody says that they believe in it, but it still works in Brazilian society. So it's complicated, and I think you're right. We should be explicit about how the term has changed, how we should use it today in terms of these new logics, and it's complicated. It's a good question.
I guess, you know, since you flip up the book, Racial Capitalism, I mean, one thing that we haven't really explored is the older, and you make the point about Freire, is the older language, the one that I'm familiar with, is not racial capitalism. but rather the relationship between race and class. And class, of course, is a product of capitalism, but not exclusively a product of capitalism, because class exists under other forms of economic organization. But the crucial point is, and this was very central to the South African debates of the 1970s, we didn't talk about racial capitalism as such. We talked analytically between the relationship between race and class, bearing in mind that class and race were both products of capitalism. And it seems to me, if you don't talk about class, and particularly in a country like Brazil or South Africa, then you can avoid the question, the subtler questions of how capitalist formations actually function.
Yeah, and I would add, just because
it's a question.
It's a question. I didn't understand. I thought it was a comment. I think you need to add gender to that too.
Of course, yeah.
And just like Juan Carlos' presentation proved, it's complicated because when you get into a favela, for instance, you talk to people that live there, they will say, okay, in a favela we have all sorts of skin colors, and it's true. But the majority of the population, it's black, and if you talk to those black people, they will come out with class discourse too, and you're right on that. They will say, okay, there's people that have better options to get a better job or working on services, just to say something, and those people are, let's just say, middle black class, but there's a relation between that middle black class and the tone of their skin. So if your skin is lighter, you have more options in Brazilian class society. So you're right, it's intertwined. And on the other hand, you can talk to poor white Brazilians, which will say, okay, I understand that we're a racist society, but look at me. I'm white, I'm poor, and I'm Brazilian. So it's really complicated. And I think you're right. We cannot, at this point in history, separate those three categories if you want to analyze the history of societies. So yes, I think you're right, and I would add gender.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Do we have additional comments or questions among the panelists?
There is one question in the chat, Martin.
That just arose now. Mm-hmm. The question is from Pedri Figueroa, and it's the following: considering that capitalism have the category of reproduced inequality and hegemony for the dominant class, how do you see the racial differences in equality between scholars? I wonder, I think this is an open question for the whole panel. One of the members of the panel was
to try to understand, to answer that question, we're speaking English here, right? Yeah. That is a clear, example, or trying to speak English at least. We're doing our best, but it's a clear example that everything that we're talking about, racial capitalism, right, and modernity too, in my case, has a epistemological dimension too, right? Has a academic dimension, right? So when we're talking about racial capitalism and the genealogy of racial capitalism, and the same with modernity, right? That has an impact in knowledge, right? How knowledge is produced, right? And we have centers of power in terms of universities. We have centers, which Cambridge is one of them, basically, right? And we have, you know, in this relationship between universities in the north and universities in the south, there is always a racial dimension that is pretty obvious, right? So I would say that to try to answer the question, that everything that we have been talking about today has a epistemological dimension and is related to knowledge and the production of knowledge, you know, and there is a, we could say, a geopolitical, you know, dimension in the production of knowledge that, of course, put us, you know, in this part of the world in a situation in specific hierarchies, right? That we have to learn, you know, languages from Northern Europe, and we have to deal with that situation. So I guess my answer would be that.
Thank you, Professor Medel. Any other comments on the last question or comment from the chat? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would like first of all to thank profoundly thank the panelists for this contribution to the seminar, to the joint venture seminar between Cambridge University and University Diego Portales on the context of the Global Humanities Network. I think we have counted with very substantial contributions from the geographically, conceptual, and historically perspective. Thank you, Professor Dubow, for providing us the perspective from South Africa that is, for Latin Americans, it's something like new and allows us for comparative studies as well. And thank you, Cristian Castro, Juan Carlos Medel also, and Carlos and Claudio Barrientos for the contribution. I don't know, Felipe, if you're now in charge of closing the session.
Yeah. I can do it.
So maybe it's the moment to close the session. And,
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Felipe.
Thank you very much. It's been nice to
Claudio,
meet
Juan
you.
Carlos, Professor Dubow. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the organization.
Thank you very much indeed.